This is Faisal. Faisal used to work for depth security up until a week ago.
Yes.
Yeah, so he's moving to New York to start a new job, hacking all of us from New York instead of from Kansas City. Yeah. And he's just an awesome security researcher. So he's going to present to us today on some medical exploitation that he did on some
A glucometer.
So, a glucometer, yeah. I try to get it right. So we will get you started. So here you go.
Perfect. Thank you.
Faisal.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, Andy, for having me out. It's a pleasure to talk. I could talk hacking all day, but I'll try to keep this a bit short. So basically, at depth, sometimes we have slower weeks. And during those weeks, we decide we're going to purchase something and hack it. And in this particular instance, it was a glucometer. So that's basically a device that measures your blood sugar level. You poke your finger, it measures your glucose levels. It synchronizes it to a mobile app. And then that synchronizes it to the cloud. So there's a couple of attack surfaces there. And we'll talk a bit about that. So a little bit about me. I'm a penetration tester and a security researcher. My interests are particularly in red teaming, pen testing, security research. I also do some reverse engineering and binary exploitation, but that's more on my own time. When I'm 40 and retired, I'd like to pursue AI and sentient intelligence so my fridge can talk to me. I can have great conversations with my fridge. I'm also interested in combat sports and music, so if you guys want to talk about that afterwards, we can do that. So a little bit of backstory for this. Our CTO at Depth at the time that I was working there, Jake Reynolds, like I said, there was a slow week and we wanted to investigate something, have some impactful research. I just described how the device works, and basically there are two attack surfaces. So you have the Bluetooth communications between the glucometer and the cell phone, and then you have the synchronizing from the cell phone or the mobile app to the cloud. So there's a web attack vector there. So the summary here is that through 5 low or medium severity vulnerabilities, we were able to compromise every user's data and also modify any user's data without them knowing. So this is about to get a little bit technical. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask me in a bit. So there are 5 vulnerabilities. The first one that you need to do, typically when you are pen testing a mobile app, is you need to bypass certificate pinning. So if they're using, basically HTTPS to talk to the backend, you're going to need to look at the requests that are happening between the mobile device and the backend. Now, in order to do that, typically you do something like burp. I don't know if any pen testers here pen test using burp, but in order to bypass it, there's a couple ways to do it. The first one is if you have a jailbroken iPhone or a rooted Android device, you can change what the certificate is if you know where it is. That's usually the weakest way to do it. There's something called runtime hooking with Frida, and this is basically like, when the program runs, it's almost like debugging it as it runs, and if it makes certain function calls, you can override them, so if it checks for the SSL cert, you're always like, yep, this is right, so kind of like on-time debugging, or runtime debugging. And then there's this cool tool that Burp made, it's called Burp Mobile Assistant, and it does exactly that. You don't have to worry about doing the hooking and debugging yourself. So basically now we can look at the requests that are going from the mobile app to the backend. Great. So the second vulnerability is a very popular or well-known vulnerability with web apps. It's insecure direct object references, or IDORs. And in this case, in an IDOR vulnerability, if you're able to log in and change a number, let's say a user ID profile or something like that, and you get a different user's information, this is bad news, because you can iterate through the entire number space and get everybody's information. But there's a catch. The responses that came back after you change the ID were actually encrypted. So at this point, we're going to have to dig deeper. But here's a sample request. So basically, you can see in the request that we have a user ID for the currently logged in user. But if we change that, we can get a different user's encrypted blob. So when you change it, you get a different response down there. It's encrypted, but it's a different blob. So a good hypothesis at this point is, hey, if I can decrypt this, maybe I can get another user's information. So we need to go deeper. So this is the third vulnerability. At this point, we need to figure out what the encryption scheme is and if there are any encryption keys involved. And as you'll see in a bit, there's actually an encryption key and an initialization vector. Now, the code base itself also has its own encryption scheme. So if you can break that and make it, so if you're going to reverse for Android, you're probably going to be dealing with Java bytecode. If the obfuscation scheme is weak, that'll make it really trivial to reverse. If you're dealing with iPhones, like IPAs, typically you're going to be reversing ARM assembly, and that is, reversing assembly is fun, but it's also very tedious. So in this case, we had the two options. We can either go with the iOS IPA or the Android APK. So we decided to go with the APK because let's see what that looks like. Well, it turns out that the encryption scheme was pretty weak, and just by using a simple reversing program, it just gives you the stuff. And you can see here that we have the variable A, or the method name actually, and we have a lot of logging information. If you can see the log message, this tells you exactly what the methods are doing, and this is terrible news from the vendor's perspective because anybody who reverses this, the strings themselves aren't obfuscated, so it tells me, hey, there's an encryptor function there and there's a decryptor function there. I know exactly what cipher suite they're using now. Great. So we need to dig a little bit deeper to figure out what the encryption key and initialization vector are. So again, log messages in production environment, this is terrible. Also, we have the encryption scheme. So now we need to figure out how this encryption scheme is being used. So this is the fourth and fifth vulnerability, and there were two issues. First thing is that the encryption key was statically coded. That means that there was no way, they weren't using any method to generate it on the fly. So typically, if you ever tried to make a key generator for a popular program, so you would reverse the program, you figure out how the license key, when it says enter your license key here, well, do they just compare it to a string or how does that work? Actually, if you look behind the scenes, there are popular modules that these guys use that are really hard to reverse engineer, and that's why it's a cool challenge for reverse engineers to try to break. But if you have it statically coded, that's literally the easiest thing you could do is just reverse it and look at the key. So the way to fix this is you need to have some sort of runtime encryption key generation code that gives you the same piece of key, but the way it generates it would be really tedious to reverse. The second problem is that for this encryption scheme itself, they were using a statically coded initialization vector, and IVs are supposed to be used as nonces. That is a number that is used once, so you're not basically reusing it all the time. You can generate it in a less sophisticated manner during runtime, but it has to be different every time, and then you can get both sides of communication to agree on what it is, and then you can communicate. So there's a much more secure way to do this than just have it statically coded. So here's a screenshot where, as I was reversing the Android Java code, we were calling that method A, if you recall, and we were passing three arguments here. So the second one is the encryption key, and the third one is an initialization vector, and those two are used throughout the entire code base. And now we have access to any user's encrypted data. We have the encryption scheme, we have the encryption key, and we have the initialization vector. So theoretically, we can read anybody's information. So there are some challenges. First of all, if you reverse the code base, you'll notice that they are base64 encoding some parts of the response. Secondly, interpreting the decryption key and initialization vector, you need to know how to actually interpret it. Like when you look at the reversed code base and how you implement it in your own program, you need to be using UTF-16LE. That's just an implementation-specific detail. And then the biggest pain was Java, because the crypto libraries that I was using in my decryption program did not accept the key length and IV length that I was trying to use. And I spent maybe 2 or 3 days trying to figure out why until my coworker was like, hey, let me try this on my computer. And the same code worked on his computer. I'm like, what's going on? It turns out that he had an upgraded JDK, basically, with upgraded crypto libraries. And that worked on his machine. So I basically just had to upgrade my version. Just another thing that intensifies my hatred for Java. But yeah, thanks to Corey Shea and Dan Lawson. Corey came up with the Java version, and Dan came up with the Python version, which I ended up using more. There's another reason to why I didn't use Python to start off with. It's basically Android uses Java, so I was like, I'll write a Java program because it'll be exactly the same. I should have just used Python. And it says go play the Mutt CTF. I gave the same talk at B-Sides KC, so we had a CTF there. Okay, so we have all this stuff. Let's actually put it together. Let's weaponize it. So what we can do with this is we're going to be able to retrieve some medical data, pump-related information. There's a lot of stuff. And then the other question now is, can we actually modify end user's data? So this is actually the first POC. This is the Python program. I'm running it, and I feed it this jumble of text, which is in the response. It runs, and then you can see that it successfully decoded the object here. And so this is only one sample of the requests, where when you decode it, it gives you like the date of birth, the gender, there's some insulin dosage stuff. But then there's a bunch of other requests that synchronize your previous glucose reading levels, how much insulin you actually need, and that's where it gets a little bit dangerous. So this is the first response, we decode it, and then we change the user ID, we get another response, we can decode that. So this was the POC that, hey, I can log in as one user. We created 2 test accounts, by the way, before any of this, so we're not messing with any real user data to maintain the integrity of the patients, because they have nothing to do with this. So with 2 test accounts, you log in as one user, change the user ID to the other one, and then you can grab their fake information, or the information that we preset. Cool. So now let's go a little bit further. Can we modify any other user's data? And the answer is yes. So basically, it turns out there's another request that the web app or the mobile app makes a web request with the user ID with an encrypted blob of information to update that user's information. Well, if you just change the user ID and do the reverse process of the decryption, so you encrypt that object with the same encryption key and initialization vector, and you change the last updated time to something that's a little more recent, so the backend server will accept this new information, you can change another user's information to whatever you want. There's a cool attack vector here. There's an account takeover you can do, because if you can change any other user's information, that includes the other user's email and the password reset flag. So if I change my email address to something I control, and then change the password reset flag to true, then the backend server will send me an email resetting that user's password to whatever I want. So I think that was fun. So the impact here is that if you can change somebody's insulin requirements over a long period of time, it doesn't have to be by much, and those are the most sinister attacks, is the things that you're not setting somebody's thing to 0 or whatever, but basically, if you say that they need more insulin than they need by just a little bit over a long period of time, that can have some consequences on their health. And also, if medical staff rely on this information, it can actually affect their medical prognosis. So how much insulin they need, what their glucose readings are, So this is one of the requests, again, that I was talking about. We just attempted to change the gender code of another user as a proof of concept, because we didn't really want to do anything too crazy. So some things you can do with damage, again, and the object here is the total daily dosage. There's inject insulin. There's also another thing here, which is the number of reminders you get every day. So if there's, let's say your grandma or an elderly person, relies on their phone, hey, I'm going to get 28 reminders every day to check my glucose levels and get a reading. If you set that to 0, she might forget. So here's an attack scenario. Grandma is rich, she's old and diabetic, and her grandkids want inheritance money to come a little sooner. If they are able to identify her user ID and basically manipulate her previous glucose readings and how much insulin she needs, she might not be around any longer. So, yeah. That last part is a joke. My grandma's not dead, but people did not get that last time. Okay. So, just saying, I've been using my skills to good use with my grandma. Okay, so. So the timeline for this, a lot of people think, you drop an O day on Twitter or whatever, and it's like overnight things work. Actually, this takes about 6 to 8 months. We disclosed on October 15th of last year. It took maybe a couple of weeks for the actual research, and then the vendor was really cool. They accepted. They're like, okay, these are vulnerabilities, we're gonna fix them. They emailed the user base. I got one of those emails with my test accounts. And then we disclosed publicly February 14th of this year. So yeah, again, it's about 6 to 8 months, depending on how sophisticated or how long it takes you to do stuff. Because you dedicate a week of research time to this, and then you get another assessment or an assignment. You end up spending a lot of extra time out of work working on this, and the hours, there's no way to really know how much you exactly put on it, but until it's a finished project, you kind of have to keep putting time on it, so. Okay, so the biggest takeaway, I think, for this talk is that none of these vulnerabilities, when you do an assessment, are considered high severity or critical. They're either low severity or medium severity, but hacking, when you hire an offensive security person or somebody who just does this for a living, they're basically an artist. They're chaining together, or they're trying to figure out how to chain together low severity vulnerabilities in a manner that can ultimately topple down the empire, that can bring down an entire organization. And that's why it's always harder for the blue team, for the people working in defense, to really secure things, is because we just really need a few small holes here and there, and then chain them together the right way in an attack scenario, and we can compromise a lot of people. A lot of people rely on scanners and all these, like the artificial intelligence buzzwords, all that stuff. It's all some algorithm somebody programmed, and there's really no art, no context to how you put together these vulnerabilities to actually exploit them in a sentient manner, in an intelligent manner that can, like I said, topple down an empire. So low severity doesn't mean you should ignore it. Anyway, any questions? Faisal rhymes with Basil. So, yeah.
Does anybody have questions for Faisal? Yeah. Well, I'm going to just cross right in front of there.
So were you able to talk to the backend server because of the certificate, getting a hold of the certificate?
So proxying communications, so you mean talking to the backend server, like were we able to proxy communications?
So I get that it gives you back any user information because it doesn't validate what user you are. Mm-hmm. So is it just use the certificate to validate that the communication is coming from the app? Is that?
The app will refuse to talk to anything that does not present the right backend certificate. Does that make sense? That's why you need to trick it into talk to me. Like the burp proxy, basically. You're trying to trick it to talk to that, and then you proxy the information back to the backend. So the mobile app itself won't make the requests if you don't bypass the cert pinning originally. Okay. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
And then they were also missing a what user are you check.
Right, so that's a lack of authorization. Basically, you should not be using a user ID number for anything. It should be your session token, and the backend will look at your session token and correlate it with your user's information. There should be no user 120, admin equals true. That kind of stuff shouldn't be happening, so yeah.
Hey, did you guys, when you did this, Faisal, did you guys end up getting paid from this? I don't know if you can tell me that.
We did not get paid for this, yeah. So like I said, it was a slower week in the office, and we literally, Jake was like, this is an interesting part of health, and I can't remember if he had a relative or something that was diabetic and using a similar device, so we're like, okay, glucometer sounds interesting, so we literally just went on Amazon. It's like, this cost $40, let's do it. came with an entire package. I spent a day like poking myself in the finger and trying to figure out how to do it. So it was fun, but like, yeah, no, nobody paid us for this. This is how security companies build like a legitimate portfolio over time. As a pen testing company, is you try to find vulnerabilities and help out other companies for free, basically.
So you spoke with the people, you guys disclosed the finding. Can you speak to their level of, let's say, surprise or expectancy? Like, whenever you said this, were they like, yeah, we really don't do much around security here, or were they more like, oh man, we really thought that we had this one nailed?
So actually, all of their code bases and everything had been scanned by popular commercial scanners, which is worrisome to me. But they were also, at first, when I contacted their chief or director of security or whatever the person's title was, he thought I was trying to sell him something. Like, oh, hey, you might have a few vulnerabilities, and if you hire us, we'll be able to fix them for you. It's like, no, dude. Here's the write-up. I sent him a PDF, and eventually he took me seriously when he read it. But it's always like that. They're always going to be like, I don't want to buy any of this. And the second thing is, yeah, he was pretty shocked because he said we run our code bases through scanners, which is why I had the, hacking as an art. It's, you can run scanners all day, but at the end of the day, anything is hackable because finding vulnerabilities is a search space problem, and humans are terrible at search space problems. And it turns out that the more you search, and the more you search, the more you can search. It's like a triangle. You start at the top, and then it just gets wider and wider. Maybe you can't compromise an application at the app code level, but maybe the server running, taking the request is vulnerable to something completely different. So for search space problems, I mean, that's what Google is here. They're a search engine, but it is kind of an art to be able to have an intuition of where to look and how to change stuff together and stuff.
And so just to reiterate,
yeah.
Since this is being recorded, right? Okay. What you're saying, if I understand this correctly, you as an expert in security, consider yourself an expert in security, would say that sometimes people believe that their stuff is relatively secure, they've done some level of scanning, but whenever a person dedicates some time to finding flaws, frequently they find flaws. And so therefore the people who are responsible for securing their code should probably consider doing a slightly more in-depth analysis. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but would you say that exactly?
No, the problem is, the more time you spend, so there's always going to be vulnerabilities. Depends, it's always a trade-off. Like you can spend more time and find vulnerabilities, and you can understand like from companies that have a limited budget that are trying to spend on, we only have so many pennies to spend on securities, we can't spend more than that. But people that are, the hackers and the researchers, they have their spare time and they want to do the research. So the time they spend is going to be the time that, So the best thing you can do is just no system is safe. That's my, motto is like, always keep testing. And sometimes you don't know how to take advantage of a certain vulnerability or another vulnerability, but if there's, like I said, a chain of them, it could lead to a pretty catastrophic compromise. So, yeah.
Any other questions? I think what Faisal's trying to say is keep spending money on him. He wants to be. We actually use depth security. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. We use them for some of our vulnerabilities, penetration testing and stuff like that. And they find things. I don't know if any of you are on teams that have had a pen test through them, and they find great things for us. So, yeah. Thank you, Faisal. I appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah.